So let's talk meta. All right, let's talk meta. And I want you guys to kind of adopt some new terms here. Basically, we're going to talk about meta. Now, I don't know where meta came from. I thought it got backronymed or hackronymed, where it's like most effective tactic available. I don't think that's actually what it stands for. I think, like I said, that's just like a backronym or whatever, people making it up after the fact. So there you go. Metagaming. Meta means essentially most effective tactic available. And what that means for gaming is essentially you're trying to find out, if I'm a high level player or sometimes even a low level player, what is the commonly accepted strategy. Now we're generally referring to, I've got my notes here. We're generally referring to higher level. And the question is really asked, when played well, what gives good value? And obviously when we talk about meta within the Overwatch context, we're talking about characters, we're talking about heroes. But obviously, meta isn't just heroes. It could be playstyle, like the meta playstyle or the choices that you generally make when you're playing this character. For example, if you're playing Soldier 76, the meta playstyle is generally to be flanking. If you're playing Widowmaker, you generally take a long sightline. But there's ways to bend and break and adopt those rules depending on the situation, depending on whatever you want to do. Flanking Kiriko versus a heal bot Kiriko, the meta playstyle may depend on how overtuned her healing is. In addition to that, you got maps. Okay, so like what maps are meta? So like what is the meta approach when you play this map? How do you approach this map? What maps are generally more popular, more competitively viable? What maps do people tend to avoid, right? People hate Clash right now. It's very random, very volatile, and very awkward to play, very defender advantage. Generally, people will have avoid a lot of random maps if they have a solve strategy like Circuit Royale, where there could be some sort of poke advantage or something like that. Could be composition. Another one, guys, meta is also main versus off healer. Okay, so main plus off healer. Why is it whenever you watch high level Overwatch, almost exclusively for the last like 7 years, you've seen this healer that puts out a lot of healing plus this healer that doesn't put out a lot of healing, right? So the meta isn't just the heroes that you play, but the type of combinations that you have. Ryan Zarya, Ryan Diva, Winston Diva, Orisa Sigma, main versus off tank, main versus off healer. Those combinations are meta. Now, what combination specifically is meta, it depends further. Generally running a utility support plus a support that puts out a little bit more healing is meta and has been meta for like, 8 years? It's always been the case. Another combo that you see in high level play is combinations of DPS, right? You talk about Tracer plus hit scan, Genji plus hit scan, flanker versus hit scan. Why is that the case? Because having a character that has some form of mobility that can contest short angles and then a character that can contest long angles is usually very, very, very useful, right? So you have combinations of that are focused on controlling different types of the map. You very rarely see 2 long-range DPS. And a little bit more commonly, but not as often, do you see 2 short-range DPS being combined into a meta. Basically, the priority of meta and the priorities of meta are threefold. And we'll type these up actually because we'll scribble because, funny. These are comfort. In other words, how good am I currently at these things? All right. This is immediately what's very important, right? What am I already good at? What am I already comfortable at? What is familiar with me? Now, comfort and familiarity are very similar, but not exactly the same. I'm already good at this, but it's been a while. That would be comfort. This has been recent. That's familiar, right? So comfort, familiarity. And this is an interesting one, guys. Meta is very simple. Usually very simple. Not always, but usually. Best example I can think of this is whenever there's any sort of a meta shakeup, the West has always resorted back to Brawl. Some form of Lucio or Juno speed boost, Mauga or Orisa, Ramatra, anything that is not complicated to understand, not complicated to take space. A lot of push-pull. You push when you get in an engage, you kite when you don't have an advantage. You go back and forth, right? Brawl is at its core is the definition of simplicity, right? Now, it's execution. It's not always so simple, but at least understanding the surface level is very simple. And they're often simpler characters, right? You can get really good on focusing on the push-pull when you're playing Mauga or when you're playing Orisa. Why? Because the individual micro and complexities of the character, well, they're there, but they're just a lot less than a lot of other characters, right? That's what makes something like a Tracer so incredibly impressive, because she is not a simple character and yet is repeatedly meta because she just has that insane value say. But more often than not, we want simple compositions. We don't want to play dive. We don't want to play complex hybrids. We just want to play the old comfort and familiar that are comfortable and familiar oftentimes, not just because they're strong, but because they're simple, right? It doesn't take perfect micro understanding to be able to pick up and play the character at a relatively high level. Yes, so the reason why simple matters, guys, and I want to elaborate more on this, is that you want to be able to get value out of the characters immediately. And some of you guys might be thinking, well, aren't these high-level players? Like, if we're talking about professional GM players, why is value immediately so important? They're not bronze. Chat, why is value immediately so important? We kind of touched on this already, but why is it so important? The answer is simple. The answer is simple. You can focus on macro or strategy. You don't have to experiment. You don't have to worry about your mechanics. You don't have to worry about how to control space or how to take space or all the nuances and the details. You can just focus on when we have this ult, this is plan. Everything gets simplified so that you can enhance your execution. So what we're going to talk about is meta really is just the battle, not even really the battle, but the rise and fall, we'll say, innovation and execution. That's what it is. Okay, I know it's kind of cut off there for a second. Innovation is finding out what should we do. What should we do? That could be, again, playstyle or maps or heroes or combat. And execution is how good are we at actually doing it. And the reason why there's oftentimes a bias early on towards simple is so that you can focus on just the execution. You could just focus on, let's not be creative or clever. Let's be simple and let's just do it really freaking well. And people like that. There's a bias towards that for most people because when you do simple things, it is way easier to get immediate feedback, right? When you innovate and you try more complicated things, your feedback may not always be 100% positive from the get-go. And so as a learner or as a competitor, it is often immediately discouraging to innovate and fail because you will often fail when you innovate. It's not only experimentation, but also then executing on those things are difficult. So people, teams, I mean, literally, I've been in teams for years. You can try, if you try to innovate and it doesn't go well the first scrimmage, that often is the death of the innovation. That is the death of the innovation. And I'm not exaggerating. These are professional players. You lose a scrimmage. It could even be versus a really good team. You innovate, it goes badly, don't try it again. It's gone. And anybody that's been involved in coaching or professional teams knows exactly what I'm talking about. They either have to be a trust in the process or know that that's a good old familiar strategy, or they see somebody else better than them doing it well. Now, generally, the longer a game is lived, generally, this more established the meta is going to be and the more accurate the meta is going to be. But that's not always true. A lot of times, though, the more established things can be, the more blind spots that we can get cemented into. Like, we never considered this, right? Or we never considered that. Best example, we'll talk more about this later, was goats. We toyed with triple tank, but, triple support bad, triple support bad, triple support bad. New characters introduced, Brigitte, but nobody really limit tests what that character is capable of or what tank synergies are capable of. I mean, even when we had triple tank, Ryan Zarya Diva wasn't often the combo. And this is the case how it was for a year and a half, 2 years of professional Overwatch. Why? No, just because we don't do it that way. That's the way we've always done it. We do 2-2-2. Most of the time, our free triple tank, we do it with a Roadhog or something, right? And so the meta was established, but it wasn't accurate. I think the other thing to keep in mind here, as we kind of go back here, is the definition of meta is different for different games. All right. So what are the meta philosophies? So we'll talk about meta philosophy here really fast. And this is really, really important because metas don't happen in a vacuum. Many of you guys play chess. That is the example of a meta philosophy in a vacuum. It's not changing. It will remain forever the same. It's not going anywhere at all. Meta philosophy with chess is always going to be the same. Now, the way that meta is interpreted and people will innovate and come up with new ideas will constantly change, but the game is essentially the same and will not change. But within the esports, especially, sometimes real sports, but mostly esports, things are constantly changing. Now, the question is why? Chat, why in esports and video games things more likely to change? Patches, right? But why? But why are there patches? Some of you will be like, oh, balance. Yeah, but why? People complain, player retention, novelty, new things, news, content, and also a legitimate attempt at improving their game. You see, it's easy to balance a game like chess because chess is extremely simple. The more complicated video games we have today, it's really hard to get it right the first time. So what you have is you have a meta philosophy. Let's talk about Overwatch 1's meta philosophy. Guys, what was Overwatch 1's meta philosophy from what was communicated versus and also what was actually done? How many of you guys remember? This is going to be more of a painting with a broad brush, more simplification, probably an oversimplification of it, but what do you guys remember? Each character should have a very unique identity. Right, so that's not a meta philosophy. That's just a hero design philosophy. But that in of itself is a meta philosophy. You understand what I'm saying? We're focused more on the identity of the character. Make a complex game easier to play over time. That Jeff Kaplan did indeed say that. Each character should be playable even if not optimal all the time. They usually want to help other characters defeat the current meta as opposed to removing the current meta. Right, this is why we had Brig. Brig was invited and created to kill dive, to role play as the dive killer. Do nothing. Force the player to adapt. That is also true. So Overwatch 1 was, we'll use some adjectives here. Glacial. Blizzard, get it? Very slow, very minor balance patches for almost the entirety of its career. Nothing happened for long periods of time. Now we'll talk about why that was very important. Nothing happened for a long period of time. Patches sat, metas would sit for years. They'd sit for years. Less clarity. Let's say opaque, maybe would be the right word. Okay, not really clear on what their balance philosophy was at times. When patches kind of came out, not a lot of balanced design things. Skill ignorant, we'll say, or not even ignorant, but we'll say they ignored. Okay, we'll just use ignorant for now. But they didn't care whether low skill characters were meta. They didn't care. You know, you'd have a lower skill, easier skill floor character be meta for a long time, and we don't care. Unreceptive. Yeah, unreceptive. In fact, Jeff Kaplan was convinced that GOAT's meta was a skill issue. And I'm not exactly... Okay, you can't see that, so we'll put the unreceptive on it. Jeff Kaplan said that GOAT's meta was a skill issue. They didn't really care. Very unreceptive, skill ignorant, as in we don't care what heroes are high meta or not. We honestly don't care. Very slow, and no real clarity in what their balance philosophy was, if at all. And that was the case for years and years and years. Now, a lot of it was novel. It was still a very new, exciting game. And it's still Overwatch, so a lot of people still enjoyed it. But it was a mess. If you wanted clarity and skill-based meta, Overwatch 1 was not for you. Now, there was one good thing about this, is that because there were very slow balance reactions, like very, very slow, we actually had time for innovation. We'll talk more about this in a second. But basically, there was a lot of time if you wanted to try creative new strategies. You had all the time in the world to innovate because it wasn't going to change in 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 months. So you could probably come up with a strategy, be the meta strategy. And we saw that. We'll talk more about, we'll do some examples of this later on in a bit. So less patches meant that there was time for innovation, which meant that the actual meta was more likely to be true, because people had more time to solve it. Doesn't mean that there weren't blind spots, 7-year blind spots, like Jarl Fred said, but less likely. The Overwatch 1 meta was more likely to be accurate than the Overwatch 2 meta for these reasons. Let's keep going now. Let's compare that to Overwatch 2. Guys, what would you say the Overwatch 2, let's just focus on the last year specifically, because I think that's where they've started to really cement their philosophy. There's been an evolution. There's been a transition period, right? Where do you think Overwatch 2's balance philosophy has been for the past year? What would you say? Maybe we can contrast it with Overwatch 1 a little bit. Variety, right? So there's a random character. A lot of times they will buff or nerf 1 or 2 characters just to cause variety. They like variety. Alec Dawson has also said so publicly. They want variety in the meta. And sometimes it can feel kind of random at times, right? Rapid, very rapid patching. Very rapid patching. And not insignificant all the time either. Much more aggressive than Overwatch 1. Okay, so this is where I'm going to disagree with you, some of you guys, because if you've been paying attention to Overbuff over the last year, and I have, if you've been paying attention to the meta and ranked, and from Platinum to Grandmaster, which I have, you guys might be angry at this, but it's true. For the most part, skill biased. Skill biased. With a heavy bias, for the most part, towards letting encouraging or discouraging lower skill characters from being in the higher ranks. Orisa has been gutter tier for a long time. Literally the worst hero in the game, win rate wise, for a long time. Roadhog, been very bad for a long time. Mauga has had his moments, but he's not been... since Season 8, he's never been hard meta. Bastion's terrible, has been for a long time. Moira Mercy have been terrible for a long time. Lifeweaver, terrible for a long time. So it's not perfect, and there are still the random things that people get unhappy at, right? This irritates people. I understand. But the last year of Overwatch, you don't even have to take my word for it. Pull up Overbuff. There is a lot more specific direction, and it's been over so many patches, it's not an accident, right? So now the thing that I have had a problem with Overwatch 2, which is unrelated to their meta philosophy, which is that I'd like this, but I would like a slow migration towards taking the floor up, like bringing characters like Orisa and Roadhog into more skillful positions. And they have not done that. They don't do that. That would be a criticism. But I don't think that anybody can say that Orisa is too strong and has been too strong recently. It's not true. It's not true at all. She's horrible. She, I think, is like at something like a 40% skill rating. Sojourn, good. Kiriko, good. Juno has been good. Hazard, oppressive. Genji, good. Tracer, good. Tracer, downright oppressive the last year. Hitscan has had their moments. About the only quote-unquote low-skill character that you can argue is maybe Junkrat at times. So we're not going to get down into hero design, character design. I'm not going to go down that road today. But yeah, there's been heavily more skill, certainly more skill-based than Overwatch 1, okay, in comparison. But we'll keep going here. There's one other adjective that I would put in here as well. What was it? What was the word I was going to go for? Receptive. Receptive. Not perfect, because also the community doesn't always know what it wants and doesn't always communicate those things clearly, and everybody has a different idea, but much more receptive and much more communicative than Overwatch 1. And again, that one is pretty much objectively true. Relative, right? So, meta philosophy. Receptive. Now, what is the bad thing? So we're saying all these nice, good things, but what is the maybe the one downside about these things here? Specifically, the rapidity in terms of the meta philosophy. No time for innovation. Now, I'm being facetious, but there's less time. We'll just abbreviate because it's going to cut off anyway. Innovation. There's less time for innovation. There's not a lot of time to figure the game out, try new things. Things happen quickly. And so people at the highest level will often just fall on the lowest hanging fruit and roll with that. So all of this being said, like there's different games will have different philosophies, and this interprets itself in different ways. And the reason why it's important to say this is because you need to know where you are on the meta scale, because this is where the terminology comes into play. Okay, let's get sauced. You guys ready for our terms today? Finally, we're here. Shake up, early solve, late solve, true solve. Oh my gosh. Okay, look there. What's a shakeup, chat? You guys tell me. You guys have sat here. What's a shakeup? What's a shakeup? Patch, right? Patch or innovation. Significant innovation. Somebody comes up with a crazy new idea. Shakeup. Everything changes. All right? Everything changes. What's early solve? What's early solve? Simple, easy. Yeah. Simple. Or obvious. I always say the movers and the shakers. Not just what's familiar, but who obviously got buffed, right? This one's tricky. We haven't talked about this one as much. This one is tricky. This one's a hybrid. This is somewhere in between, right? Synergy, yeah. Refinement. Here's a good way of thinking about it. How to beat solve. So in other words, what's the best version of the solution that we figured out? A good example for this would be early solve back in 2021 Grand Finals meta, or maybe it was 22. Anyway, long story short, was Winston, Tracer, Sojourn, Kiriko, Lucio. Kiriko was broken, Winston was broken, Sojourn was broken. Okay. Now you notice that one of those characters changed by the time the finals meta came around. Tracer became Reaper, because people realized that if you ran Reaper, you could beat that composition. Now, if they didn't run that comp, like let's say they ran something completely different, Tracer was still really good at controlling off angles. But if you ran the mirror, if Winston, Sojourn, Kiriko, Lucio, and whatever was always played, Reaper provided a little bit more value in the neutral trade, because having that deep flank control wasn't as powerful. So late solve was, hey, let's substitute Reaper for Tracer because that beats the mirror. We'll talk more about examples of this later. What's true solve? And obviously true solve comes with a big asterisk, right? We'll actually put the asterisk there, right there. There never is usually really truly a solve unless it's something really simple like tic-tac-toe, right? What's true solve? What is best? And this is fairly set in stone. Fully optimal, almost certainly fully optimal. What is best? We've tried the weaknesses. We've tried this and that. And remember, we go back to innovation and execution. We go back to innovation and execution. Every single one of these, there's a focus on execution. We want to get their execution up. We want to get our execution up. We want to get our execution up. The question is how much space is there for innovation? For here, in early solve, there's a lot of innovation potential, right? A lot of innovation. Late solve, there's a little bit less innovation potential. And true solve, there's very little innovation potential, right? So there's a constant, not even a battle, but a synergy of people trying to innovate and then solving, and innovate and then execute, and then innovate and then execute. Let's give some examples. You guys ready for this? Overwatch 1, GOATS meta. Oh boy, I have this bookmarked. This is it right here. This is it. Go to point, turtle on point, cheat the system. And we saw more and more and more of this from Team GOATS. Now, this is what we would call innovation. To be honest with you guys, like this had never really been done before. Not anything specifically like this. Well, here's another clip from some more GOATS play here. Similar kind of situation. You guys might remember or recognize early Lemon Kiwi casting from this. And this is super funny. Watch this. They just walked a point. Watch. Just watch this.
Yeah, that is a thing.
Halt. Nah, it's fine.
Support as well, so that's going to be a bit of a...
They just walked the point. Junkrat, Hanzo, damage boost, Orisa, and they just walk the point. And shockingly, they just kind of sit on point and they live, and that's it, and they win. This is GOATS. This is what we would call, if we were to call this somewhere on the spectrum here, this would call an early solve. Innovation reset our understanding of the meta. We thought 2-2-2 or Orisa and double sniper and Mercy. No, it reset the clock. We went back to what we thought was a late solve in the meta, and we actually went back to a shakeup and to an early solve. We devolved. Metas devolve when innovation happens. You go backwards. So they went back to shakeup, and then what was the early solve, chat? What was the early solve for GOATS? Just mirror GOATS. Mirror GOATS, play GOATS. Like this comp seems really strong, like really hard to beat, right? Just play Moira and Brig, Lucio, Diva, whatever. Just play GOATS. Now, what was the late solve for GOATS? I'm gonna really test you guys in this one. What was the late solve for GOATS? Remember, go to our definitions. What was the best version? How do you beat Moira GOATS, guys? Zen GOATS. So people were like, Moira's pretty good, but what if it's just a GOATS mirror? Could you play Ana? Some teams played Ana. Better ult value, right? You had to deal with Matrix, but yeah. And then people were like, yo, we have so much sustain. What if we just go Zen? And you went Zen. You went from Moira to Zen. And it didn't matter because you had a second support ult, which was just as good, if not better than Nano. And you had insane shield pressure, insane off-angle pressure, and Zen never died. You just didn't die. The late solve was like, let's just make a better version. What's the best version of the meta that we have right now? Okay, so let's keep going with this. What was the true solve, chat? People innovated and tried new things. What was the true solve? From what we understand at the time. Well, yeah, a lot of it was just Zen GOATS. Yeah, a lot of it was just Zen GOATS. What was the true solve, though? There were some innovations. Whether they were better or not, we don't know. But there were some innovations. We saw triple DPS. It wasn't really better than GOATS, but you didn't have the capability of playing at the highest level. It could work. You saw Sombra. Now, Sombra GOATS, Sombra would replace the Diva, and you would often, because you had hack, you could hack the Diva, go for big anti-nades. There's all sorts of nasty things that you could do with Sombra. Sombra would hack the Rhine, and you could go for anti-nade. So you'd do Sombra GOATS. Now, was Sombra GOATS better than original GOATS? When I was coaching at the time, at the highest level teams, no, I don't think Sombra GOATS was better than GOATS, but we don't know that. We don't know that for sure because the highest level teams weren't playing it. But Sombra GOATS definitely was an equalizer. If you couldn't play with the highest ranked teams, Sombra was a wild card. It allowed you to, the true solve was knowing that these guys were inferior compositions, but they could compete. And it mixed things up. It gave you a fighting chance. We even saw some situations where teams were situationally running Baptiste, right? Very, very niche situations. But yeah, there were situations where it could work, right? So there were options here. You could throw in some stuff in there. And so what this was GOATS tried and true. And this is what made GOATS so strong, is that people had so much time to innovate and it just didn't matter. But yeah, I think the key point here is that like there's a clear bias for players to innovate when they need to. Like if you guys notice, a lot of the innovation comes, whether it's Clockwork Vendetta, Team Avoided, which back in Dive 222 days or Double Shield days was running Ball and Diva and Lucio Mercy stuff. because they had to. They had the players that could play those characters, and they couldn't compete on the other characters. So the innovation came through exceptional people doing exceptional things. The innovator versus the min-maxer, right? So like you see that even now. Like you will always see that. Like what is a team that's performing at the highest level and what is not? And there's all sorts of biases that come into play here. It's really interesting. Western teams always have a tendency to prefer brawl characters because they're more comfortable and they can focus on the push-pull macro. Korean players have a preference for dive because those are the type of characters that they're comfortable playing. But Korean players also have a tendency to not innovate when they're playing versus each other. They take the honorable mirror all the time, even when they know that they're going to lose, right? Western players don't innovate versus each other for the same reason, but if you put a Western team versus a Korean team, they're more likely to innovate because they know they're likely to lose. It's just really interesting. And there's even all sorts of bias where if a good team solves the meta early, it's more likely to be wrong because there's a false confidence instilled in that meta because a good team played it. That's why you'll often see a lot of good teams coaches being praised for innovation because they won with the innovation, but it may have not been that the innovation was good. They're just a good team playing a composition. You get what I'm saying? Oh, what a crazy innovation from fill in the blank here. When it wasn't, he has a great players playing the comp. I don't know if it's good or not, but if you did the exact same thing with, the Joe Schmo over there, right? Like it might look stupid, right? You just was well executed, right? So it's really hard to divulge. It's really hard to specify whether this is a good strategy or a good execution, and we don't always know. I guess the most important thing that we learned from here, and the reason why I yapped on this for like an hour, is meta's growing stale. How many times have you guys heard that before? Stale meta. It's not an easy problem to fix. Map variety, different types of maps, whether it's Age of Empires, Marvel Rivals, Overwatch, whatever, helps. Hero bans, the concept of hero bans, whether you think they're good or bad for the casual game, they do help with variety. Also, hero flexibility helps a lot as well. It allows different choices to go in different directions, right? But it's not easy, right? It's not easy because you think about it, the more patches you have, well, then people are going to lean on that early solve. There's less time for innovation. But the slower you patch, the more time you get for innovation. But then also the rest of the meta can be still for everybody else. So I guess the point of this being here is understanding the psychological progression of how metas are created. And how, as a viewer, you don't immediately, when you see Malga being played at a pro level, don't go, oh, Malga's broken. You go, we've seen this character before. I know the Western players can prefer that. This might just be an early solve. Or, oh, this character is trash. Well, we don't know that yet, as we learned with Juno, or as we learned with Goats. We don't know if that character is trash. We need time. So there's a lot of interesting thought points here that even affects casual players. Casual players are affected by meta, not necessarily by their ability to execute the meta, but they are influenced by meta. So lower rank players will watch pro players or pro streamers, and they develop opinions based off of those pro players that influence their play.